Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of LunchBytes. In today's episode, we expect everyone to be aware of others, be friendly and patient, be open to questions and viewpoints, be welcoming and respectful, be understanding of differences, and be kind and considerate to others. For our full code of conduct, please go to aka.ms/eventscoc. Today, I'm your co-host, Annika Jane. I am an app innovation specialist at Microsoft. I've been working at Microsoft for around 3 years, and it's been a very, very exciting journey. I'm here with my other co-hosts.
Hey everyone, my name is Tighe. I'm an app innovation and cloud solution architect, and I've also been here for 3 years.
Hi everyone, I'm Brennan. I'm also a cloud solution architect and now recently moved into the app innovation specialist role. So I'm typically co-hosting as well, and great to be here.
Thank you, everyone. And today we've got an exciting guest. She's going to be talking to us about how to deploy securely AI into Azure. So do you want to do an introduction?
Thank you so much. Yeah, hi, I'm Juliane, and I'm a Azure technical specialist, another fancy name for just saying that we're here at Microsoft to help our customers move their applications, their infrastructures, as well as their data into the cloud. And as AI becomes more and more popular, not only in the private sector and for trying maybe a ChatGPT that you've maybe have tried when it was still free of charge or maybe still using it, it's also that enterprises need to adopt AI more and more. And today's session is all about how can you securely deploy AI into your enterprise application using Azure, the Microsoft Cloud. So AI is basically a winning game for every industry. Actually, the IDC also says companies that are slow to adopt AI were left behind. And this is already very visible in all different industries. For example, in healthcare, you see AI can be used for risk analysis for patients, for maybe lifestyle monitoring. In manufacturing, you can use AI for quality control or for supply chain management. Retail is using it increasingly for virtual shopping assistants. And fintechs use it for portfolio management and monitoring, for risk and fraud management. And probably you've already all seen AI in the automotive sector with signal recognition or with highly automated driving or autonomous driving. For example, different car manufacturers that you might know their names. In agriculture, it is used for drone analysis to see how the crop is growing and how maybe changes into the fertilizing has to be made in order to get the best outcome of their crops. And in marketing, it's used for social media ads or for marketing automation to just increase the sales of all the products. So you see it as a wide variety of topics where AI can be used. So right now in this talk, we want to look into how you can build greenfield application. This is an automation. This is an application that you build from scratch, where there's nothing there. That's why it's called greenfield. But this is not very common, especially in enterprises, because you already have applications and you maybe want to enrich those applications with AI. So we will have a look at that as well. And then there are certain scenarios where you can't put your data into the cloud. Maybe because you're in a military scenario or you're somewhere where there is simply no internet connection. So we will also look how you can put Azure AI Services into an on-premise environment. But let's start step by step. Let's look, what do I mean when I say AI, and what do we in general mean when we say these are AI services and these are Azure AI services? You can roughly categorize them in 4 categories: vision, speech, language, and decision-making. For vision, you have everything like custom image recognition or face detection or emotion detection. Speech is text-to-speech or speech-to-text transformation. Language is document analysis or sentiment analysis. And decision-making is how to use an anomaly detector to prevent failure in your machines. And Azure supports a wide variety of languages that are constantly increasing. We also provide you with certifications for audit and security reviews, and you can use those services with either a REST API to just call the service, or you can use a library SDK. If you're a developer, you probably know what an SDK is. Otherwise, probably the REST API is the better option. You can run those applications in different environments, but you can also put it into a Docker container. A Docker container gives you the opportunity to add an extra layer of security, to add compliance, or maybe because you need it for other operational reasons, and we will dive into that in just a couple minutes. You can try all the Azure AI services for free. You can also sign up for Azure for free for 1 month, and I think the best is really to just get your hands dirty, to play around, and to have an understanding what it is capable of doing, because it's really nice that I can tell you things about it, but it's even better if you explore it yourself. So you can try it for free, and maybe you can use it in your private or in your enterprise scenarios in the near future. And because AI is such a big topic, and it is something that is created by humans, but it's also able to add a lot of content that is not manually approved by a human, it is really important to have guidelines for responsible use of AI. We also provide this, and please have a look at all of our responsible AI guidelines. I will share the link later. And then we have OpenAI services. Probably you've played around with ChatGPT. This is one of OpenAI's services. OpenAI is a company that Microsoft is partnering with, and we created the Azure OpenAI service. This basically means you have an OpenAI service that is brought into Azure, and you have this more or less the same capability. Sometimes we're 1 or 2 weeks behind, but in a secure environment to create your applications, sitting in the same environment where all your monitoring, your databases, your applications, maybe your large language models or any kind of data resides. So you can use OpenAI services seamlessly in Azure. It is also secured by you, and I will touch base on that with just a second. And you can add your own data sets. So if you are a company and need to add certain data, certain catalogs, certain information from maybe some policies, if you're in insurance, you can do so too. And then those information are also part of your AI analysis. You can also fine-tune your AI models once they're set up, and you can call them again either via REST API or via a client library SDK, or you can use our provided web-based interface, which is especially good if you're just getting started with AI, because it is a guided way to set up your first AI service. And again, we provide you with built-in responsible AI, and we give you some extra documentation how to use the AI service in the most responsible way. We have more than 500 customers now using Azure AI services, and this slide is just a short overview of some of the companies. Maybe you've seen one, or you know 1 or 2 of those names, and have maybe already used some of their AI services as well. So let's start how you can build your AI service. I mentioned that a greenfield application is an application that you built entirely from scratch. There is nothing there yet, and this is the best way to get started with AI. You can log into the Azure portal and then follow a guided workflow to set up your first, for example, chatbot. And then you're given 5 different steps to add your base model. For example, you want to use GPT 3.5 or GPT 4, or you want to use ChatGPT for your model. You can choose networking setups if you want access for everyone, or if you want to restrict access, maybe for only internal purposes or for certain IP addresses. But I will get back to that as well in just a second. And then you deploy your model. And this screen that you see on our little laptop over here is the state when you've deployed your model. You then have the opportunity to test your chatbot. You can add system settings. This is how your chatbot will behave. Maybe you wanted to answer all the questions in a really nice, friendly way, or maybe you want to add some very technical knowledge, or you want to maybe also use a different language to respond to your users' questions and conversations. You can also add your own data in the left top corner, and you can then fine-tune how many tokens, so how precise the answer to each one of your questions will be. But what we're talking about today is about how do we secure the AI applications. And security is always a multi-step process. There is not only one layer of security. You can think of security like you have something very, very important, maybe an old watch from your great-great-grandma that has not only a high value for you, but maybe also a high monetary value. You don't only lock your front door and then keep the watch on your kitchen table. You probably put that maybe somewhere in a more secure place where you add some extra locks, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you even put it in a different place. For example, in a bank that provides you an extra zone of security. And the same is true for IT. You don't only have one firewall or one password, username and password setup in order to get access to an application. So what you want is, first of all, you want to monitor your application, and then you want to add security. So if we look at this diagram, we'll see that you have your Azure OpenAI service in this little blue round circle, and then you monitor the performance, the requests, maybe also if there is some unusual behavior, to figure out when your service is not working as its best and when you have to intervene and maybe have to make changes or even take the service offline in order to investigate what is happening. And then we add security. In this case, let's say you have a web application for your manager who wants to interact with certain documents that you store on your company database, and your manager has a UI interface, so a web application that he or she opens in her browser, and this web application is put into a subnet. A subnet is a security construct where you have a scope of IP addresses that can enter as well as exit traffic in and out of the subnet. So in this scenario, we only allow access to our Azure OpenAI service from the IP range of the subnet. So only this web application is allowed to enter our OpenAI service. And then we also add some IP restrictions. So not everybody, not the entire world from outside is allowed to access our web API, web app, but we only restrict it to the IP addresses, for example, within our company or within a certain region. And we can block other IP addresses. So in this scenario, we already included a monitoring for our OpenAI service, as well as a two-step security process to only allow the web app to access the OpenAI service and then to additionally restrict IP addresses to enter our entire application. And then we have something that is called a landing zone. A landing zone is an approach that helps you to manage your resource in a structured and a consistent manner to ensure governance, security, and compliance. And while this might look very complex at the beginning, if we go step by step and go from what we already know, we see our OpenAI service on the right-hand side and see that we had monitoring and that we have a subnet that is only allowed to call our OpenAI service. We added a key vault, which is a secure place to store secrets, certificates, or any other key value pairs that need an extra level of security. And we have some databases to store our data that need to be persistent. And then we use private link. Private link is a secure connection between our OpenAI service and other Azure AI, other Azure services in general. For example, a function, a Kubernetes cluster, an application, a database, etc. It simplifies your network architecture, and it's just another way to provide an infrastructure security level for our application setup. And if we then move further to the left, we see an API management. APIs are an extra level of abstraction as well as security. An API allows you to call different services, and if you make changes into your services, people can still call the same API, and then the person who created the API from the service has a contract with the APIs to always provide the level of information that they agreed in the API. For example, an ID, a name, a telephone number, and a Boolean value if a certain value is true or false. So adding an API management is our third layer of security over here before we enter our AI services. And this API management is then also connected to an application gateway. An application gateway is a firewall for your web application that protects you from, for example, cross-site scripting or SQL injections. So it is our fourth layer of security. And if you look totally to the left, you see this little laptop, which implies general users wanting to access our application. And you can then also add some identity control. In this case, we see over here in Azure Active Directory, where people need to log in with their password and username in order to have access. So this is just a rough understanding of a landing zone, and this can get increasingly complex, and Tighe will talk about that in just a minute. So we talked about greenfield applications, but quite often there are applications, for example, you have an online store and you sell products, Halloween products, clothes, whatever you want. And the user comes, opens a website, and then wants to have an overview of all the products that you have on offer. So basically, we now have the user, that was the little laptop in the last screen, and this user's journey starts at the application gateway, where it checks for cross-site scripting and, for example, SQL injection, so that nobody harms our application. It'll then pass the request to our API management and then into our storefront, where all the products are displayed, all the pictures for the products, as well as the opportunity to order the product. And if the user wants to order the product, then we have an order service that takes care of all the order handling and queues our orders if there are a lot of orders, for example, I don't know, on a Black Friday, and then stores all those orders in a database. And you've already seen over here, this is an AKS cluster. So this means this application is deployed into a Kubernetes cluster. A Kubernetes cluster consists out of different microservices that are called by one another from triggers and events, and then will be executed whenever needed. This architecture allows us to add AI without manipulating the entire code. So what we're doing over here is we just take a new AI service, for example, to enhance our product description with AI. So some managers decided that they wanted more content for the users to describe a certain product, but they don't have sufficient staff, or maybe the staff is not well enough trained to do so. So they then provide all the technical information with an extra data set and add an Azure OpenAI service to create those product descriptions. So while you start to create your OpenAI service first in the Azure portal or via a client SDK, once it's finished to set up, you can then put this AI service into a container, and you can then add your container into an existing Kubernetes cluster. And if you, for example, add a new button into your store admin UI so that an employee that needs to add some new information for your products, they can then click the button and the button will call the new service, our AI service, to then generate a product description. So this is a nice scenario where we see our landing zone security set up with the application gateway, with the API management, and with a VNet, and the AKS cluster could be in its different subnet as well, and then adding just one container to add your AI capability. So all of those application scenarios were still in the cloud, but I mentioned that it's also possible to put this offline or in your own on-premise environment. You can use the same Azure AI services and APIs as you did in the cloud. So you don't need to change anything. If you set up something once for the cloud, you can reuse it on-premise. It is only available for the Azure AI services, and these include, for example, speech, language, vision, and document intelligence at the moment, but we're increasing the services continuously. You have the flexibility to bring your Azure AI services closer to your users or closer to your data. And you can use it on-premise for maybe compliance, for security reasons, or if you are on a very remote point on this planet where you maybe simply don't have internet, or maybe you're not allowed to have internet access because it is a military purpose where you're using any kind of AI services. The only thing that you would need in order to leverage Azure AI services on-premise is a Docker engine. And a Docker engine provides you the capability to provide a container around your service. This is exactly what we've seen in our Kubernetes cluster just a second ago. But this Docker container can either be part of a Kubernetes cluster as well as of its own Docker environment, for example, a container application, or wherever or whatever your use case is for any kind of containerization. So let's have a look in how a use case will look like. Let's say we have a call center and we have a user that is calling a call center agent, and all of the conversations are stored in an on-premise server. In order to get some more information on, for example, the sentiment, on some key phrases that are used within our talk or within the conversation, we then send the information to Azure and use two different AI services. First of all, we need to transform our speech to text. And once we have the text, we then perform the sentiment analysis and extract key phrases out of the conversation. And in order to make the outcome a little bit more user-friendly to view, we put it into a Power BI overview, which is a tool to provide you with graphs, heat maps, or any kind of data visualization to see how you're performing for this one call, as well as trends and statistical overview in general over multiple calls. And you've already seen this is still all in the cloud, and I promised you that this would be on-premise. So let's see how this would look if we just transform it to on-prem. It looks exactly the same because you can use the same APIs, you can use the same setup. The only thing that is not there anymore, all the services are not hosted by the cloud provider and maintained by the cloud provider, but they are hosted and maintained by your IT team. So the caller and the call center agent still have the same conversation. It is still stored in the telephone server, but the audio files will then be sent to an on-prem database and then used to transform speech to text, as well as the sentiment analysis, and then for visualization using, for example, Power BI or any kind of other visualization tool that you already use. Again, if you add APIs between those steps, you will further abstract the different services, and if you make changes to one or the other, they don't affect the opponent service because you have an agreement with your API, and whenever you have an API, you will get the response back that the agreement documented that it will provide. So now we looked at 3 scenarios. You got an overview of how to get started with AI to get your hands dirty, play with it, and follow a guided way, because then you understand what is needed and what can I add as an additional layer, for example, of security, for performance, for storage, as well as for monitoring, and how you can add AI into existing applications as well as onto applications that don't even live in the cloud, but that are away on the edge or in an on-premise environment. All the parts that I talked about today are also available free of charge and on our Microsoft Learn websites. And we have 3 QR codes. You have an overview of all of our Azure AI services. On the left QR code, the code samples that I showed you today are also in a GitHub repository, publicly available and free of charge. So if you feel like you want to fork one of those, or you want to extend it, or you just want to play around with it, take the code samples and get started. And we also have a learning path if you want to become more proficient, or if you want some certifications. So these learning paths enable you to take one of the Azure certifications for Azure AI.
Awesome, thanks, Juliane. That was brilliant, showing us some of the scenarios there. I quickly wanted to touch on some of the extra details around the Azure OpenAI landing zone that you mentioned as well. And like importantly, you kind of gave an initial setup into what landing zones are really, and acting as essentially the fundamental resources that we need to really go ahead and securely deploy AI into Azure. And that's some of the reasons why we need them, is they add that organization really and give us the right tools that we need. And for example, in the Azure OpenAI landing zone, and you'll see in a second, there's a lot to it. But some of those key services, like you mentioned, really runs API management. We might have application gateway in front as well, and some of those services. And in fact, this is the whole view of some of that Azure OpenAI landing zone. So you can see there's loads of different areas to really focus on. On the far left of this, there's actually identity, and looking at how, for example, we can make sure that only authorized users are using our APIs that we have. We've got an area that's all focused around connectivity. So the networking side of things that you mentioned, those private endpoints and making sure that all the networking is done securely. That's all taken into account here. And hopefully for those people who have worked with landing zones before, particularly in Azure, a lot of this should be quite familiar. So you might already have existing connectivity subscriptions that you're using, and existing identity subscriptions that you can then utilize if you're looking to develop using Azure OpenAI. And so within the Azure OpenAI zone specifically, there's a few different key services that I'm going to demonstrate as well. And so that's all around API management that we have here. And so we really want to make sure that users that are coming from maybe a particular application or from the internet are going through the desired route that we have. So if they're trying to access our Azure OpenAI endpoints, they've got to go through Azure API management first. And we might do some authentication and authorization there. We might start to implement some policies about rates and how many times people can call those APIs, and really focus on that different area of authentication. Now, for everyone watching, there's a couple of resources that are really useful for this. So the first thing that I'll show in 1 second is a document shared around the Azure OpenAI landing zone reference architecture, written by Freddie Ayala, and that goes and talks about some of the key principles and processes in place as to why this landing zone was developed. But then importantly, it's not just theory. We really want to be able to share kind of a practical approach that people can go ahead and learn this OpenAI landing zone. And so what a couple of colleagues in Microsoft UK have done is they've created an OpenAI landing zone hack. And so this sits within Liam Moat's GitHub. And this is what this QR code will go to. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And you can see some of this different stuff we've got here. So this is the Azure OpenAI landing zone reference architecture documentation, the article that was written about it. So you can see some of the existing infrastructure and what gets deployed, but then also details about how you can go and understand the different services that are in place here. So we've got API management, for example, web apps, and some of the AI services that Juliane was just mentioning, particularly also around those managed identities and getting application gateway in front of this, really acting as, for example, your web app firewall so that only particular applications can go ahead and work with those really cool OpenAI endpoints that you might have. Now, from a practical side of things, how can you go ahead and learn some of this? Well, that's where the OpenAI landing zone hack comes into place. And so this GitHub page is the starting point for all of that. And so we've got a brief introduction of what you want, but importantly, you want to end up in the different hacks that are available. So you've got hack 1 and hack 2. And just to note as well, if people really enjoy working through this, they can go ahead and please do contribute back to this. It is open source. It is all around just helping everyone learn and really focus on the OpenAI side of things. So the first hack, and what you'll need for this is a GitHub account, an Azure subscription, and access to the OpenAI services that you've got. So you can go ahead and apply, and there is a link for those as well. But if you have it already enabled within your Azure subscriptions, then perfect, you're pretty much ready to go. So what you'll need to do is to really create a repository, first of all, from a template that we've got. And so this will allow you to bring in, for example, the infrastructure as code files that we'll have to then be able to deploy your landing zone and work with that in your Azure subscription. So there are instructions here on how to do that. And you can go ahead and then, once you've got all that set up, is go and use the new Azure Developer CLI. And so this works, essentially, you just create an environment that you've got using AZD in it. And this will set up your environment for everything that's going to deploy into Azure on the OpenAI landing zone side of things. You might initially have to authenticate to Azure to make sure you're logged in. But the brilliant thing with the Azure Developer CLI is that you essentially just need one command to then deploy all of the infrastructure, all of the stuff that you've seen in some of those architecture diagrams into your subscription. And that is AZD up. And so this acts very much just like one command, like an npm start, something similar to that, where everything gets going, and it's AZD up is what you have. So maybe Terraform init and then go. It's a similar process for those who are familiar with that side of development. And so what this will do is it'll go ahead and deploy those services that we talked about in that architecture. So the likes of API management. And so this process will sometimes take approximately about 45 minutes, depending on how long the API management takes to deploy. But once you've done that, that's everything that you pretty much need to do in terms of getting your services up and running. This is the architecture that it goes and deploys. It's got that API management. It's got private networking, an important aspect that we see a lot of organizations really looking for. And if you want to review the infrastructure as code and look at some of those bicep files, then please do. You can do that link. So once you have everything set up, you will have an environment where you've got API management and some existing APIs that are part of that as part of the whole deployment. And these APIs are how you can interact with Azure OpenAI, for example, in this scenario. So you can go ahead and start testing it and asking it questions. So in this scenario, there's one question that's asked, what is the capital of France? And hello, my name is John, what is the capital of France? And then you can go ahead and send that request, and you will get your response from the OpenAI. And this is all accessing it through API management rather than going direct. So we've, for example, got policies in place that then will allow, you need a certain subscription ID to then access the APIs and stuff like that. So obviously this is a very simple command, just understanding what's the capital city, but this is just the beginning really. So this is your way in to then ask more complicated questions, or to really look to generate content using OpenAI. That's the first lab, and it's just getting everything set up, getting everything into place. The next lab is really all around how can you implement chargeback. So what we see sometimes from organizations is, hey, we really want OpenAI to be used across the board in Azure, but we don't know how we can do that across our whole organization. Like we've got many different teams, many different business units looking to use this. How can we make sure that, for example, that certain business units are getting charged based on what they use? You might have a certain business unit using OpenAI heavily and racking up like a bill, for example, and then other business areas using it more light touch. How can you understand as an organization where is your usage going? And this part of the hack lets you go through that. So what you do here is you're essentially going to create a logger within API management, which will allow you to essentially track the number of calls that are going from your users or your applications into Azure OpenAI through API management. So you'll implement a logging policy, and then we'll go ahead and essentially create ourselves an Azure function. And our Azure function, all it will do is pretty much call our OpenAI endpoint, and it will have, for example, codes that will then allow us to log the information. So this is logging chargeback data, and this will go into application insights, utilizing an application insights connection string, for example. So whatever your environment is, it connects to that. And that's a good thing about the AZD, the developer CLI stuff, is that when you initially set up your environment, everything will be set up so that you have the relevant resources in place. And so you can go ahead and then essentially track that information and have your function called with chargeback data, and then go and get that information. So the number of tokens that your API call used, for example, that's an important thing for organizations to understand, because that's essentially how we directly bill usage with Azure OpenAI. And so once you have your function created, you can do this in Visual Studio or VS Code, for example, you'll want to understand how can we get the metrics out of that in the end. And so that's essentially just what you do, is you create some custo queries within application insights. And these are the examples of the different queries you can go ahead and use. And you can go ahead and create your own custom ones as well. But essentially what this graph is doing, and this is created using custo, is it's showing us the number of tokens. And I'll try and zoom in as much as possible here. The number of tokens that are being used, for example, per time of the day, based on which subscription is calling them. So for example, we might have business unit 1, and they've started calling APIs at 14, in between 14.19 and 14.20. And we've seen just over 50 tokens used, getting up nearly to 100, and dropping down and back up to over 100, about 120. Compared to maybe business unit 2, these lot have started using up to 100 tokens initially early on, and then they've really ramped up their usage. And so they might be having systems that are time dependent, where there's a lot of usage at certain points in the time. You can really understand then how much usage all the different business units are happening. And it's an important really area of the security side of things, is understanding usage within that area. And so this hack that you can go and do, there's 2 hacks to it. I've just shown there's the chargeback side, and then there's the first side of getting everything into Azure with all the secure networking. This is publicly available. I would definitely recommend people go and try it to really focus on getting hands-on with Azure OpenAI, and particularly the landing zone. And then you can go ahead and play with it. You can still start to build your own other functions, start to link it to app services that you might have. Really, how can you take existing applications and really modernize them and build them into AI applications? Well, this is your starting point, really. And it's a great resource that you can go ahead and use, that particularly some of our colleagues in the UK have kindly developed and worked with. And so to go after that content, you can visit aka.ms/OAI-LZ-hack or scan the QR code, and both will take you to that area. Now, we wanted to have a little bit of time for questions. Annika, how are we doing?
Yeah, we've got a few questions. So the first question is, how do other customers start adopting AI into their language? Into their landscape?
I can take that one. It is really a step-by-step process, and you shouldn't try a Big Bang theory or a Big Bang approach, because this one is a guarantee for failure, because you haven't started running before you knew how to work. So it's really starting to learn how to work with AI, for example, in a secure environment, like a hackathon, or you create a sandbox environment where you have a maybe an application that is close to your enterprise application, but doesn't live neither in their dev nor in their test, and certainly not in their prod environment, but that is really independent as a data source, as a subscription from any other workloads that you have. And a hackathon is a really nice way, because then you can also have different teams that have all the same requirements, but then they have different approaches how to solve it. And if you then let the different teams present to one another, you get a sheer amount of different ways to approach this problem. And I think that is actually a really, really good way to understand what people want to get out of AI and how you can use AI to your benefit, so that it actually adds and contributes more than a human being can do.
Yeah, amazing. We have 2 more questions for you. So the second one is, what's the biggest challenge for AI adoption?
Well, the biggest challenge that we see is the governance and the security part to add your AI into your applications in a reliable and into a compliant way so that it meets all the standards in the EU, in the US, and throughout the world, so that customer data, if they are involved, are handled with the right care and with the right way of compliance that is mandatory to all kind of all kind of data, because AI is not something special, nor does it have an extra status. At the end, everybody wants that their data is kept securely, and not only because AI is dealing with it, other rules apply to those kind of data security.
I agree. And the last one is, in what area does AI for developing increase productivity and the speed of development the most?
Well, I work a lot with developers, and I see that they don't really like, for example, to write tests. But then there are approaches to development that is called test-driven development, where you have to write the tests before you can actually write the functions. It was always a nightmare for me when I was a student, because I sometimes just didn't know what the function should do and how can I write all the tests beforehand. I mean, you can solve this issue, you can be aware of what you want to write, but still writing tests is like cleaning up every day after you're cooking. I don't think that this is fun, that anybody likes to do those kind of things. So if you can have AI to help you write the tests, this is a major increase, not only in speed, but also in motivation. And the way it does it, you basically have your function, or you write your requirements. And if you write your requirements in, I don't know what kind of environment, you can copy paste your requirements into, for example, your IDE, your coding environment. And if you use the product that is called GitHub Copilot, so it is basically the AI for coding. And there are two different options. One is GitHub Copilot Chat, and one is GitHub Copilot that is an inline editor. So where you write your code, if you put in a new comment, and you then say, please write a test, or you just say /test, GitHub Copilot will write a number of tests. And if the tests don't meet your requirements, then just add more information, because at the end of the day, feel like AI is a really smart colleague of yours. Sometimes AI just can get things wrong as well, like as your colleague can get things wrong. So the more information you provided, the better the outcome is. And always remember, AI is non-deterministic. And non-deterministic means if two people put in the exact same information, they won't receive the same output, because it will always generate new content from the amount of code and information that is given. Just one point before I want to close this answer is, we won't take, and GitHub won't take your code for any kind of the AI learning process. GitHub Copilot is trained on open source code and open source information. So in case you use it for any kind of enterprise applications, this information is not transferred back for any kind of reuse. The only time when the only reason why it's transferred back is because it needs to be processed, and then you will receive all the information. All the input, all the prompts, all the tokens that you're sending are deleted and not used for anything else.
That's really reassuring. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Juliane. It's been great having you, and I'm sure everyone has learned a lot. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a final thing to talk about, some community callouts. So you can find a local community at aka.ms/UK community. And if you want a call out, get in touch with us on LunchBytes at Microsoft.com. And just another thing, if you're working with us already, you can contact your account team about training options. And you can also check out some of our other episodes at aka.ms/LunchBytes. And if you have any other information or any other tips or requests, drop us a note over at LunchBytes at Microsoft.com.
Well, all too soon, we've come to the end. Thank you so much, Juliane and Tighe. Hope that everybody else can tune in for the next LunchBytes session, where we'll be joined by Dave Phillips, and he'll be talking about everything that we didn't know about functions and logic apps. So hope to see everybody there.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.